to International Podcast Day 2019, where we're continuing to go around the world and discover great podcasters, great content, great information for all of us to use. We're going to head off to France now to talk to Lory Martinez. But first, I want to talk about our sponsors just real briefly. And our first one is Blueberry, which is our platinum sponsor. Is a full-service podcasting company providing podcast hosting, podcast statistics, and podcast advertising opportunities. Find more at blueberry.com. And repurpose.io automatically converts your audio to engaging videos and uploads them to YouTube and Facebook. That's repurpose.io. And Libsyn, a podcasting hosting, distribution, monetization solution for audio and video podcasters worldwide. I'm now going to bring on Lory Martinez, who is going to wazzle and dazzle us when it comes to her content as to why translating is the future of podcasting.
Are you ready to go? Programs that are automatically translated into French, English, and Spanish. That is our language. Those are our three languages for now. Some of the past productions include podcasts in the lifestyle categories, also in the institutional categories. I've worked with brands, influencers, journalists here in Paris in English and French, and it's been a really fun project to do. And then we worked on original programs. And so this past week, we launched Mija Podcast, which is a podcast about one Latinx family's immigration story from Colombia to the US across generations. And it's a narrative podcast with lots of sound design, and it's a lot of work, but we did it in 3 different language versions. So we'll have a moment in this presentation where I will discuss a bit of a case study on how that actually came about and what really goes into translating content, because I think a lot of podcasters are asking themselves whether it's worth it to do, and logistically not every indie producer has the kind of budget that a big studio will have to do this kind of thing, but just to kind of understand why this is a natural next step for a lot of production studios that are talking about this. The other programs that we'll be releasing this fall are Wine School Dropout, which is everything you need to know about wine that you were afraid to ask kind of thing, and How Not to Travel, which is a travel podcast about how to travel consciously and really being aware of cultural differences and things like that. So those will also be released first in English and French and then Spanish. If at any point you have a question or you're interested in talking more about this translation conversation, go ahead and tweet at 80 Podcasts on Twitter and at Mija Podcast, because we will be talking about that show specifically today. And of course, International Podcast Day, hashtag. Also, if you'd like to continue this conversation about translation, I'd like to introduce a new hashtag called Pod in Translation. If any creators around the world that are watching this want to keep the conversation going about what it is to share your story with different cultures around the world, even if you're not necessarily translating your content, but you are interested in seeing your global audience and sharing it with the world, go ahead and use this hashtag during this talk and after. All right, so here's the overview. Some of you, those of us in the industry, have been following very carefully the big news that a lot of audio production companies are now expanding their very successful programs into multiple languages. iHeartMedia is doing it, Wondery Media is doing it. A few French-based studios are also launching now with multiple language content. So it seems like it's the new trend, and trying to understand why we got there, it takes a little bit of a history lesson. So even in doing research for creating Studio 80, I was trying to understand how global communications processes work, because it's true that a lot of that is coming from the US, but there are also new things that are happening in France and in Europe. So to better understand how these podcasts are turning into more global entities, we're going to look at this media and translation history. So to do that, we're going to start with film, and then television series, and then podcasts. Because I think creators in the podcast industry have a lot to learn from these mediums that are already relatively established. though they are constantly evolving, as you see with streaming services for television, and of course, film industry, which is becoming more and more global, as we'll see from the examples. Yes. So, and then that'll all come to a head when we speak about what that means for podcasts. Something to understand is that every medium, from print to radio to TV to film, has gone through this process. As soon as it gets established, it has to be translated. So this is not a new phenomena. It's kind of interesting to see that, where everyone is very shocked by this. People are surprised that this is what's happening, not necessarily, especially because of this indie industry that we wouldn't expect to be going in that direction, but it's completely natural. Every single medium has done it. And so podcasts are just the next one. I want to start with film because in my research, I found something really interesting, and I wanted to share it with you. It's that films were actually the first subtitled content and translated content. I mean, after books, of course. Books were the first to be translated. But for our purposes, we're going to talk about film. And the first translated films were the silent movies. So, Charlie Chaplin doing his thing and having a title card that could just be translated so easily. You just change the text. It was the first version of a subtitled movie. But when producers with the arrival of talkies, there was a problem because you could no longer just do text. And actually, what was interesting was that American studios tried to do dubbing themselves. So when the talkies arrived, they would have an American successful movie, Golden Years of Hollywood or whatever. They would take this movie and then they would try to translate it with different voice actors, but it wouldn't be very well done. And they didn't get anybody from the actual country. This could be someone who had learned the language at home. And so the accents were very obvious and it was too costly. And so they actually stopped doing it. Dubbing was too costly for American studios. So they ended up deciding to stop that entirely and just let the countries themselves do the dubbing. So the first country to do dubbing was France. They didn't want their language to be butchered, and so they did it. And they started taking over the dubbing of American content that was coming in. The other thing that is interesting to point out is that the reason that English language content, well, one of the many reasons, because there were several reasons, but one of the reasons that American content was always so popular in this time was because during World War II, a lot of the resources for production companies in Europe were destroyed. So what we had was this huge influx of American content via film and cinema. And all of these movies had a huge influence on having English be the global language and having it be the point of entry for a lot of different content. So that actually established what we have today, this global communications complex where American media industry and also British industry, the UK and the US are very much responsible for a lot of the big shows that are coming out of media. And that actually is not just because it's English, it's also because they translate their stuff. If they were to just, share English content, it wouldn't be enough. And so the role of translation and subtitles is huge in the media industry. And to see how this is now going to be applied to podcasts is super interesting because we have very specific challenges in translating audio that the film industry doesn't necessarily have. So we're going to talk about that. And just as a overview, we're going to talk about the two different kinds of translation when it comes to visual content and then how it can be applied to audio, right? So dubbing. As I said before, dubbing is getting voice actors to do a version of the voice. It presents a specific problem in audio because you either have the original voice slightly lower and then fade it in with a new voice that's translated over it, or you have a voice actor who is hired to be the person in another language. So 20K Hertz, just a shout out to them, they did a wonderful episode on the George Clooney in China, So the Chinese language, George Clooney, the Spanish language, George Clooney. These dubbing actors are the unsung heroes of TV and movies. And they do an excellent job in creating a kind of signature voice for each country, even though it's representing just one person from an American cinema perspective. Dubbing is the only thing that we can do in audio, though we have several other options. But for podcasters, dubbing and hiring voice actors in the other language, these are the only ways that we can kind of do this in audio. With subtitles, you have the text beneath the image in movies, but we can't subtitle audio. So what can we learn from subtitled films? And I think that's going to be, and I'm going to talk about how we can apply this lesson from subtitles into podcasts, because I think that just saying that we can't subtitle audio is not necessarily the best excuse. I think there's so much more that can be done. We have the opportunity to do something. We have the web, we have our websites, and we can use text and transcripts to apply the subtitle aspect to our podcasts. So there are certainly ways that we can apply both of these elements to make podcasts in translation. Now, I want to talk about modern translation in movies. And the reason is because I want listeners to understand the potential of translating movies and translating content. What does it offer to you to translate your podcast, to translate your transcript, or something else? What kind of opportunities does that give you? Now, as we saw from the mini history lesson, films were the first to be translated, and so it totally makes sense that today's major budget projects, like the Avengers Endgame franchise, would be using an extraordinary amount of translation work. Those big budget movies, they're big budget for a reason, but also because they have to include marketing and translation work for foreign markets. So in terms of the amount of money that was made in revenue from the Avengers franchise, 330 million of that almost billion dollar, 330 million of that amount was made in the first week in China because they translated it to Chinese. And as you know, a lot of blockbuster movies that are invested in by the big companies like Disney and Marvel, well, they all get translated for the Asian markets, and those are huge audiences. If we think about the scrappy comic book world that this is coming from, and now for it to have been developed into movies, films, TV shows, and now even podcasts, because Marvel is now doing podcasts, it's only natural that they would consider something like this, translating their content, translating their worlds into different spaces for those audiences. The second reason that this is interesting is that translating gives accessibility to a story. So, gone are the days where you'll create something in one part of the world and it won't be seen by someone in another part of the world. This is a medium that gives people access. So, with the development of the internet and all of that, we don't have any excuses to keep content to ourselves anymore. And though English is the first language, there are tons of communities online that do translations themselves just to get access to the content. So when studios themselves do it, they're taking away that step, and they're also controlling their story. So that's the other thing to consider. These stories resonate with people around the world, and even though it's a very American one, I'm going to give you another example that can kind of help shape this idea that the potential of translation. So, Parasite was an award-winning film released in France. It's directed by a wonderful Korean director named Bong Joon-ho, and this production is a story about a family in South Korea, and it discusses issues of wealth, class, and family as it pertains very much to South Korea. But it was translated, obviously, as many movies are. It's not even a question anymore. All movies are translated relatively. If they have the budget, they can translate it. It was translated and had subtitles in French, and it was released in France, and it won the Bonheur d'Or, which means 1 million tickets sold in France. This relatively local story that would never really be considered as something to be understood in French culture was shared and was loved. And it shows that good stories shouldn't be limited to one country or language. This indie movie made it a point to have this accessibility factor, and it gave them a lot of potential in terms of reach, in terms of audience reach, and in terms of cultural reach, because this is a story about a Korean family, and it showed Korean family dynamics, and also the food, and also the language, because you could hear it because it was subtitled. So there are a number of factors that can make you think. And also, it's not just an American story, because now we're to the point where these wonderful storytellers have the opportunity to do this with visual mediums. And so how can we be them? How can we take that and apply it to podcasts? So just to kind of, as a reminder, translation is potential. You have a potential to find new audiences, a potential to kind of better understand your story and have the world listen to your story, not just have it be something that is hyper local. Because as Netflix has shown, even with its streaming services, that hyper local can be very universal. So just think about how your story can resonate with people around the world. Television and translation. Now, I know it's a bit of a cop-out. I keep using big American examples, but I do think that it's important to think about the cultural influence of programs that are translated. This is a very old example, and I'm going to give two very old examples, but as they apply to France, I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. Friends television show, as many of you know, has been translated and broadcast in over 100 countries, and stays relevant today to the point where streaming services are investing in having access to syndication rights today. It has been a cultural phenomenon that has affected young people and the way that they perceive New York City, and the way that they perceive adulthood and growing up and entering the real world of work and family and all of that. And that had a huge influence on perceptions of Americans. And that is very powerful. And if you think about what we could do if we could do something like this with podcasting, where we have this very specific story, and then we're telling a story about our culture, and someone halfway around the world is going to understand our culture better because of the way that we describe ourselves, the way we tell our story. The other thing is that it created, it broke cultural barriers. It just transcended cultural barriers. Before streaming, before smartphones, before downloadable content made it easy for everyone to access everything at the same time. So think about the potential. I mean, if this is the way that it was before, what podcasts can we make today that could reach the same cultural dynamic? Now, this is a very old example, but it's the show Dallas. It's a cowboy series drama that was translated to French 40 years ago, and it was dubbed over and all of that. But it actually cemented a vision of Americans as cowboys and showed a part of America that was very local. This was Texas. This is Dallas, Texas, and that culture was what was shared with the world. And when it was translated, it changed perceptions about Americans, or it kind of shapes them. And just think, who would have thought that cowboys in Texas would be interesting to French audiences, and that it would shape their vision of American culture? And I think of this as a Latina producer. What if another kind of story was translated to French or Korean or Spanish? What if indie podcasters in the US or in other countries or in different specifically hyperlocal markets, use this medium to give listeners another vision of their world? What if, the vision of Americans isn't cowboys, it's young Latinos in LA? Netflix is already changing these perceptions with their programs and their original programs in local spaces, but we as podcasters can do that as well. And as accessibility increases, so does the access to storytelling and the ability to shape what people think of your story. Now, one more example from the TV world, before we get into the adaptation versions. I want to talk about Casa de Papel. So Casa de Papel is a Spanish drama where a group of friends basically performs heists while wearing Salvador Dali masks. It was a very successful Spanish drama that was produced in collaboration with Netflix. And the thing with this is that it is a Spanish story that is as popular as Orange is the New Black and House of Cards. It is a Spanish story with Spanish accents, with Spanish actors, and those stories are being heard. Translation and adaptation actually helps non-anglophone storytellers get their stories heard. And I think that when we think about podcasting and translation, we can't just think about it as, oh, the Americans are translating their stuff. We should also think about what other stories could be translated, even if they're translated from, I don't know, Hindi into English or French to English. What can these stories bring to the world? How can we keep those stories from just staying small? Let's make them bigger. Let's raise their voices across cultures. So translation has a cultural impact, and it can change perceptions about a culture, a people, an issue waiting to be resolved. I think a lot about, we've been talking a lot about fiction here, because that is what has been shared as much in television and in movies, but there could be something like an investigation. Something like Serial could be translated to other languages. True crime is very popular right now. Why can't a story from, I don't know, Pakistan be as popular as something like Serial? I mean, there is a potential for these kinds of things to get a global reach that it wouldn't have before. Side note about Serial, though, Serial podcast actually was diffused online, just the way that all podcasts are, and it was the phenomenon that made podcasting blow up in the US, as many know. But it was also very inspirational to podcasters around the world. At least here in France, I can say that a lot of the producers that I've met here were very much inspired by American programming, and they decided to make versions of shows that they'd heard here. You have the same thing happening in China. There is a podcast version of This American Life, but made in Chinese. And I think it's a brave new world for translation. And I think there's so many ways that we can look at content and not kind of limit it to your country market. You can make it for the world, even if you're an indie producer. And change perceptions. Now, adaptations. So it's all well and good to translate, but there's also many questions about adapting your content to a local culture. Do you want to have the headache of adapting it so that someone locally can understand it? I think that when you're translating, you have to do justice to the people that are going to be listening to you. And you have to be very careful about different cultural visions of things. So I've had personal experience with this with my Mija podcast specifically, but I want to take a minute to talk about larger local adaptations. So here we go. Fleabag is a show about a 30-something single woman. It is it is narrated by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and her counterpart in France is called Mouche, and it's basically the same script but in French, and the adaptations are just small things. It's a British comedy versus a French comedy. Some of the jokes translate, some of them don't, but it's a relative success, and the reason is because they culturally adapted it to the French market. Moosh is tongue-in-cheek, the way that Fleabag is, but it's also a universal story. And I think that's something to consider if you're thinking about translating your show, is that you have to think about whether it can relate to other people. You know, as if we go back to the Parasite example, yes, it's a Korean family, but it's a family, and family dynamics can be understood around the world. And the same thing goes here. A young woman finding herself is a universal story, and the success of the show in another language really goes from that. There's also something to deal with in adaptation, which is a kind of understanding of the story and how it applies to local culture. So Glee was famously adapted in China as well. And the story is pretty much the same, of course, but they've had to adapt for cultural nuances. So, you know, family dynamics at home aren't necessarily the same as American family dynamics. Some of the characters have accents or things that are regional that aren't the same as in the US. And these are kinds of things that you can consider by talking to a cultural consultant if you're really interested in doing something like this. And the same goes for programs like Breaking Bad, which touch topics that are very deep, deeply rooted in a specific problem that affects many, many countries, like the drug problem. So Breaking Bad in the US is Breaking Bad in the US, but Breaking Bad in Colombia is not Breaking Bad in the same way, because of course we have a completely different cultural context where the drug war affected us in a very specific way, and where you have to be sensitive to that. So creators of the program have to change their story a little bit to be culturally sensitive. So cultural context is everything, and that's what makes stories, whether they're successful or not in other countries. That's how it happens. And even if you say you're only translating, you're going to end up adapting, because there's always going to be something that's going to be more relatable in one culture and less in another, one where you'll have to explain and one where you won't. All these little changes, that they take a lot of time, and it's a labor of love, as many podcasts are. And so I think if you do want to seriously think about this kind of thing, this translation and adaptation really needs to go hand in hand. And speaking of adaptations, I'm going to talk about adaptations, but mainly in the sense of translation. So if you think about all of the successes that have been turned into television series, Homecoming, Lore, Dirty John, these 3 programs are just the tip of the iceberg. Right now, there are a lot of programs that are being translated into television, but at the same time, these programs are being translated and subtitled. These creators are taking the story that was in audio, and they're automatically thinking, hey, our users of Prime Video in Europe will also want to be watching this Homecoming show, and they're going to be wanting to see it in French subtitles. They're going to maybe want to hear it in French. And so if we think about that as an automatic choice, we know that there's a potential for more audiences for these podcast stories. So if you think about your podcast as just an entity, think about how it could be like a TV show, how it could be translated and seen in other cultures, and how this is an automatic choice for TV, and eventually it's going to be an automatic choice for podcasts. And what role can you play in doing this? All right. So again, speaking of podcast adaptations in other languages, I want to be frank here and say that I know that indie podcasters do not have the same budgets that big studios do for translation. That is the reality of it. But there are tons of ways that you can think about your audience as a global one rather than just a local one. And I think that's something that can actually, if you affect the way that you market your podcast and the way that you think about your audience, because your audience isn't just in the US, or your audience isn't just in France. Your audience isn't just in China. Your audience is on the internet, and they will find your show, and you have to think about what they're going to come across. And that's so powerful, because that means that you have access to all of these people around the world. and you can tell them your story. So with that, know that many, many podcasts that are in English are being described and shared by Apple Podcast players, for example, the best podcast to listen to in English. So in every Apple Podcast market, Pod News from James Cridland's Pod News has been reporting on this for a bit. Each Apple Podcast market now has a kind of series of podcasts in English for people to listen to. And the reason is because podcasting blew up in the States and then it went global. So naturally, a lot of these markets have already been listening to stuff in English. And so really, they're an inspiration. At least in France, I know that many of the producers that I've come across have listened to English podcasts first and now are going to make their own versions of that. So that global audience, I mean, it's a responsibility because you're thinking of your content. If you're making anything in English, you know that people in other countries are going to be listening. And as we can see from this Chartable listing, shout out to Chartable, they do a wonderful job of collecting all of the Apple Podcast rankings for a podcast. And I'm not going to mention the name of the podcast that I got this ranking from, but it's very representative of the world we live in today and the globalization of podcasts. So you have a podcast on Apple Podcast France, for example, that was produced in France with a French producer. It has both English and French in it, mainly English, but it's listened to in Brazil, Denmark, Finland, and Thailand. It is a global podcast, and its rankings represent that. So think about take a look at your Chartable listing. If you are an indie producer and you're curious about your audience, think about the people in other countries that are listening, because you can do a shout out to them, and it feels nice to be shouted out in these kind of things. I worked on this podcast called Expat, and it was all about coming home after an expatriation. The podcast was in French, but we had listeners around the world because there were French expats in other countries, but also because their partners were coming back as well. So think about how your story can be listened to in other countries, and think about maybe doing a dedicated post to those people. Maybe throw in some of the language, learn a little bit of the language and put it into your thing, because it doesn't necessarily mean translation in podcasting doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be creating dedicated full-on language productions, because not everyone can do that. But on a small scale, you can do something about your audience being global, because it always is going to be. And you can't just think of your audience as a one-off kind of section. Your listeners could be anywhere, and it's a valuable data to get this. It's valuable information to use to inform your content, inform your marketing, inform your social media, dedicated tweets and things like that. So this is a way that an indie producer could do this. What does this mean for podcasts and translation? So we've talked a little bit about these kinds of the way that English has dominated the podcasting and translation scheme, and how English is the first language for all of these things. But at the same time, knowing that no matter what language you're producing in, you could be listened to in any other country around the world. There are language learners. There are people who are fascinated with specific cultures that would want to know more about what you're doing, who are Google searching very specific topics like food, and they could come across your podcast. And so that there's an enormous potential for thinking about your podcast as a global audience thing, even outside of translation. And with translation, if you have the budget to do it, there are certainly a number of things that you could do. Now, I'm going to talk about those. Okay. So there are a number of ways that podcasts can be translated. You can have it be dubbed, as I said before, with voice actors. You can also do it the radio, NPR or BBC radio way, which is to have the original voice a little bit lower underneath it, and then have someone voice acting to come over the person, and it's a lot of sound design. It's it's an enormous amount of work dubbing audio. So that's one way you could do it. You could also just hire someone to reread the script. That's another thing. And then you have subtitles, transcripts, and adaptations. So we're going to go through each of them and how they apply to podcasts. So of course, voice acting is the big one. The main challenge for a podcast when you have voice acting is if you don't hire a dedicated voice actor or someone from the voice acting community, you might not necessarily get the best version of the text. You need to have it not just be someone who can speak the language, but someone who can play the part and sound like the person. Casting for voice acting is a very difficult thing to do. And the audio fiction community, shout out to the audio fiction community, they do a wonderful job of listing talent and sharing posts for voice acting jobs. And I think this is going to be one of the jobs of the future of podcasting is voice acting. As fiction podcasting evolves as one of the biggest new mediums and biggest new genres, you will see that this voice acting is going to become more and more important. Dubbing is going to become more and more important. Hopefully, unlike in the movie industry where we have unsung George Clooney's, we'll have wonderful Dr. Brights in other languages. And that is something that I'm really looking forward to, is seeing how these wonderful productions are going to be turned into other languages. I do want to shout out Eleanor McDowell and her wonderful project, Radio Atlas. This is another way that podcasts can be subtitled. Subtitling in Radio Atlas is basically, it's her project where she takes audio and you hear the original audio in the language. So that could be in German, it could be in Swedish, it could be in Spanish. And then on a black screen, you will see the subtitles in English. So this is subtitling for English speakers from other languages. And it's an enormous amount of work, and she does an excellent job of picking stories. And I definitely recommend, if you're interested in translation and what you can do on a small level, if you wanted to do something like that and feature a story that you believe in another language, this is one way that you could do it. It's radioatlas.org, I think. You can also do transcripts. Now, this is the transcript of the first 10 seconds of Miha podcast, the podcast that I've been working on and that I host in all 3 languages. It is our first production for Studio Ochenta, and for me, it was very important to have the transcripts in all 3 languages available online. Not only because I know that people will listen to both, like, multiple versions of the show and would want to compare, but also because, your content shouldn't just be available to people who can listen. So there are people who need to read, and we will have that content available for them. And even on the smallest level, if you don't have a budget to translate anything, put your transcript online. That will make a huge difference. And it will give people who are looking for your show the ability to follow along if they don't get something. A French listener listening to the English version can read the English and will be able to get it, or throw it into the translation thing, Google Translate. This kind of transcription work, it takes some time. I'm not going to deny it. Transcriptions are costly. I will recommend one that is wonderfully, it's cheap, and also it gives you notes and the ability to cut things out and things like that. It's called Temi.com, and they do great transcripts in English. And HappyScribe is another great transcription service that does it for languages other than English. So if you do create content in Espanol, Frances, everything, you can get a transcription that you can put online. Obviously reread it because it's an AI that's doing it, so you always have to do the work afterwards. But it can help you give a little bit more accessibility to your podcast with a text-to-text translation, or just the text itself. I do want to talk about Dr. Death and Wondery, because it is an enormous undertaking, and it is one of the biggest productions that was translated to multiple audiences. And this is an example of an adaptation. So not only did they hire dubbing actors, voice actors for the other ones, not only did they create different versions in each country, they basically took the story that was an American story and made it a universal story. So Dr. Death was translated to 7 languages, and it was one of the first to do so, more than I think it was one of the first to do so this year. And it takes a lot of work. It requires finding voice actors, project coordinators on a local level. And it's something that not necessarily any smaller productions can do, but it is an example of what is going to be done in the future. It's the example of take Dr. Death. This is Dr. Death podcast, but you can also take, think about the film examples that we talked about. The Harry Potter franchise was also translated to a lot of different languages. And if you almost think about podcasts as audio movies, this is completely normal to think of this that way. And I think with true crime and with fiction, I think fiction is going to be the one that is going to be, my prediction is that fiction is going to be the most international of the genres, because they are stories that can be universally translated. And my biggest hope is that it ends up being that way. I do want to wrap up my time with my own case study with Miha podcast. So before I get into that, I just want to say, as a final thought, as podcasting goes global, my apologies for that. As podcasting goes global, podcast adaptations and translations are the natural next step. So that is the thing that is going to be happening, and that in the coming years, when we see the podcast boom flourish and continue to flourish, what we're going to see is this translations. And I do want to make a side note for this, and it's that many people are bilingual, and we underestimate the fact that people are bilingual. And I do believe that you don't necessarily have to translate your content. You just have to think about it as global content. So that is the main thing. Now, to wrap up, Miha Podcast is our first original program that we've released in English, French, and Spanish versions. So you can look it up as Miha Podcast English, Miha Podcast French, Miha Podcast Spanish. The original story is a fiction story based on one Latinx family's immigration story across generations to the United States. And we did a number of things to be able to do this. So we had to obviously adapt each script. So the original scripts were written in English, and then we translated to Spanish and French, changing slightly different elements so that it would be properly understood in each language, but also kind of considering the accessibility factor and really making those transcripts available online. Miha Podcast is particularly unique because I'm the host of the 3 versions. I am trilingual, so I am able to do that, but normally I would be hiring a voice actor, and for the other programs of Studio Ochenta, we are hiring people for that. But I want to say that it is particularly satisfying to know that this Colombian American story, this Latinx story, is popular in France, can be listened to in French, that can touch a global audience that you would never think would be interested in a Latin story. This vision of America, the vision of working class Americans who are coming from immigrant families, you would never think that this story would be popular around the world. And there's something so powerful in that. So I think there's also something to be said for that, is that when you're looking at your content, remember, it's universal. Your good story is universal, and it deserves to be heard and accessed by the most amount of people. You're already doing half the job by putting it online on the internet, because the internet is huge, and that is going to give you the ability to touch the most amount of people already. But when it comes to podcasting, think global access, think transcripts, think making those, maybe trying to find translations that you can do online. Think all of these different things, because podcasting is no longer something that you just do in your living room. Your story that you're telling in your living room could be heard by someone in Taiwan or in India or in South Korea. This medium is so powerful already, and it's so important to think of its potential. So that is why translation is the future of podcasting, and why I think it's going to be the next step. That's it. So if you want to continue the conversation with me, you can listen and interact on Pod in Translation, hashtag Pod in Translation. Tweet me at Lory Martinez. The I in Martinez is the number 1. And yes, continue the conversation. And I'm so happy to be able to answer any questions that you have regarding translating, regarding Miha podcast. I'm also going to be at She Podcast Festival this coming October. So if you're there, don't hesitate to reach out and say hi. And yes, go ahead and listen to Miha podcast in any of the versions that are available online and enjoy. And definitely don't forget, your content is worth listening to. It is worth sharing with the world. And don't limit yourself to the smallest amount of work, the smallest local space. You have so much potential. And as creators, we can use that if in any small way. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Lory. Can you hear me now? Okay, so we're going to probably end with Lory's. We're having an audio communication problem, but what a wonderful presentation on language and content, and the integration of all of that's potentially possible, and where we're going with some of the content that we're all creating. So it's always a blessing to hear from various sources of how people are tackling some of these complex issues. So I really appreciate Lory being on this 2019 session, and we look forward to more. So thanks, everyone. We're going to disconnect this one a little bit early so we can get the presentation going. So until the next session, we'll talk real soon.
Thank you.
Can you